Hello, everyone, and welcome to CRTV 131 Contemporary American Cinema, Class 5. And we are going to be diving very deep into that second American Renaissance, second Golden Age. The first Golden Age was when? 1939 and the surrounding years, somewhere around 1937 to maybe 1945. And 1939 being a key year. And so we are in the second golden age, and I wanted to let you know about the first one so that you'd know why this one is considered the second one. And we've got some wonderful films for our class today. Let's start right off. And we have M.A.S.H, Mobile Army Surgical Hospital. And this is from Robert Altman. He'd been around Hollywood for a while. He is not a live TV guy. He worked in TV, but he was doing filmed work with some westerns and things like that. He is not one of the film school generation. He's a little older than those young guys that went to film school, like Coppola and Lucas and Scorsese and Spielberg. So he's kind of just out there. He just worked his way through and up the old-fashioned traditional way. Somehow he got in and worked his way up to directing television, and then he got into feature films. And this film was kind of low on the radar. 20th Century Fox had some other big films coming out that year. They had Patton and Tora, 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 two big war movies. And this one was really under the radar. They didn't go on location to shoot it except for into the local hills out there, some land that 20th Century Fox owns out in the hills toward the desert outside of town. And Altman's idea was to just sort of keep his head down and let them worry about those big budgeted films that they were shooting overseas and around the world. And it worked out pretty well, right? He wasn't bothered or anything like that. Nobody was checking in on him. He kept his film moving along nice and fast and under budget and so on. And this just really hit America at the perfect time. We talk about, perfect timing with movies, and sometimes a movie can come out maybe too early. And let me pick on another war film. Saving Private Ryan came out in 1998, and that was 3 years before the bombing of the World Trade Center on 9/11. And Saving Private Ryan did not win the Best Picture Oscar. It was nominated, and it was kind of a favorite, but if it had come out after 9/11, it would have been a shoo-in. It would have been almost unanimous, but it came out before America was on a very, very patriotic, war-like footing. And another film near wartime is Casablanca. And Casablanca came out just a couple of months after we were bombed at Pearl Harbor in 1941. It came out in 1942, and it was perfect timing. America was feeling very, again, under siege, very patriotic, ready to go to war. If Casablanca had come out 6 months earlier, it would have come and gone and been more or less forgotten. So we have kind of a perfect timing and not a real good timing for two films. And M.A.S.H, which came out in 1970, right at the height or the depths of America's involvement in Vietnam. And so we're going to talk about that in just a second. First off, I do want to talk about that this is a revisionist film. It's not a traditional war film. And our heroes are doctors. So they're not soldiers. They're under fire and all that, and it's dangerous. But our heroes are doctors. So they can be very, the British have a good term for it, cheeky. And I love that term. And so they talk back, they're kind of sassy, and so on. It's kind of anti-war, but kind of not anti-war. But it does seem like it might be set in Vietnam. It has a big cast. Some of the people, Donald Sutherland, Elliot Gould, went on to become stars. And the other thing, and notice I put them in italics for you there. That's to help you out. It has layered sound, and the very first scene that we're going to see people or hear people talking over each other. And Altman, that was one of his trademarks. He used it throughout his career, his long career into the 2000s. And some people didn't like it. Some of the people at the studio, I can't understand what they're saying. They're all talking at once. And Altman thought that it was very natural. That's the way real life is. People sort of maybe talking over each other, especially in a crowded situation. So that is one of his trademarks. And so back to M.A.S.H. And I mentioned the Vietnam War. Well, M.A.S.H. is set in Korea in like 1951, right? It's set in Korea in 1951. But Korea is in Asia, okay, and so is Vietnam. Now they're pretty far apart, probably a couple thousand miles apart. But if you close your eyes just a little bit, it's not hard to imagine M.A.S.H. being set in the Vietnam War with these doctors who don't respect authority. It really goes after just about everything. It goes after or makes fun of war, makes fun of authority, makes fun of religion, makes fun of medicine. Really, there's nothing. Sports, even sports. There's a football game between two rival camps toward the end of the movie. The doctors, the stars, the actors, their hair is probably longer than they would have worn in 1951 in Korea, some even with big mustaches and things like that were popular more in 1970 than it would have been in 1951. And there's even a scene, which freaked me out when I saw it with my friend in high school, passing a joint around. And I can almost guarantee you that nobody was smoking marijuana in Korea in 1951. But they put it in the movie, a little bit of a wink to the contemporary audience. So technically, it's not a Vietnam War film. And when we talk about Vietnam War films with Apocalypse Now and so on, M.A.S.H. is technically not a Vietnam War film. But they really, other than possibly M.A.S.H., like I said, Hollywood didn't really know what to make of Vietnam War. And maybe one or two movies were made during the war about the war. Okay, one of them was by John Wayne. I'll talk about this later, the Green Beret, which is pro-involvement. I won't say pro-war, but pro-involvement. And M.A.S.H., and that's about it until years after the war was over. So we needed a little perspective on all that. It's not Vietnam, but boy, it sure seems like it. And Altman was very revisionist. He did a revisionist Western, McCabe and Mrs. Miller, a guy that wants to set up a gambling parlor, and House of Ill Repute is a nice way to say whorehouse. Mrs. Miller is the madam of the house. Brewster McCloud, which is kind of like a fairy tale about a young guy that is, and he kind of has like a fairy godmother that's watching over him. He's trying to build a contraption that would allow him to fly. The Long Goodbye is a detective movie, just like the 1940s Humphrey Bogart movies by Raymond Chandler. Matter of fact, it's by Raymond Chandler, based on material by Raymond Chandler. Only this is set in Southern California, where the novel is set, but we have hippie types and lots of smoking marijuana and long hair and all of that. Okay, it's based on a book written in the 1940s, but it's revisionist, and he's going to take a kind of a different look at the whole detective genre. Nashville with another big cast. Most of these movies had great big casts and so on, not much star-driven. And he had some rough going in the 1980s. Not much in the 1980s, but he kind of came back in the 1990s. He had The Player, which was nominated for all sorts of awards and did quite well, and Gosford Park in 2001, which also did quite well, another one of those big, giant casts. So he was hot for a while, and then he cooled off, but he stuck to it, and somehow he came back. So good for Robert Altman. Next up, we have one of the big ones in a lot of rankings. And I don't want to make too much of rankings, but that's kind of partly what we talk about with a consensus, right? With a consensus, with everybody sort of agreeing. And The Godfather in many of these rankings comes in number 2, um, uh, only to Citizen Kane, and that's it. All right, it took quite a while. It came out in '72, but by the 30, 40 years later, it had worked its way into the top 10 and then into the top 5, and there were still a couple of films above it, like Casablanca. And in some recent ones, The Godfather has come in number 2. A lot of people bunch The Godfather and The Godfather Part Two together as one film. It's not one film. The other one came out 2 years later. They didn't shoot them at the same time, like Peter Jackson did with The Lord of the Rings. He was sort of making that one big movie. He shot all 3 movies at the same time. We'll talk about that later. But The Godfather Part Two, nobody was thinking about it until The Godfather became a big hit. The Godfather only covered probably less than half of the book. The book was a big seller. So then The Godfather Part Two came out, and in a lot of polls and rankings and stuff like that, they call it the Godfather Saga or The Godfather Part One and Part Two. Technically, it's not. So anyway, I'll just say that. But they are good together, and if you like The Godfather, I'm sure you'd like The Godfather Part Two. But let's talk about The Godfather. That's Marlon Brando right there. He was only in his 40s. He was a big star in the early 1950s. Okay, we didn't really talk about Brando before with A Streetcar Named Desire and On the Waterfront, some amazing films. He started on Broadway stage and so on with On the Waterfront and movies like that, or Streetcar Named Desire. He was just, God's gift to acting. He was just, the guy, the man. He changed it with the method acting and naturalistic style and all of that. But he was a little eccentric. He wasn't always prepared when he came to set. He didn't always choose good material that would showcase his talents. He went off to Europe and made some movies and made some bad choices and things like that. And so in the late 60s and early 70s, people weren't really thinking about Marlon Brando to star in a big movie. Now, The Godfather wasn't going to be a big movie. At first, it was based on a big bestseller book, and lots of movies, and we'll talk about this a little bit more too, but lots of movies are based on books. It's great source material. I just mentioned Lord of the Rings. We've got the Twilight Saga. We've got all the Harry Potter stuff. We've got the James Bond stuff. Let me see, what else have we got? Lots and lots of stuff. Jaws, right? Lots of big movies are based on books. And when they do the Oscars, they have, based on, if it's original or based on other material. Usually it would be from books, but sometimes it's based on plays, like maybe The Sound of Music or something like that. So anyway, it was a book, sold a lot, and everybody knew it was going to have to be turned into a movie, but the studio wanted to, kind of not spend too much money on it. They thought they had a good source material, but mafia movies were not popular back then in the late 60s and early 70s. This is the era of The Graduate and Easy Rider and all of that. And there hadn't really been much in the way of mafia movies since the 1930s with Jimmy Cagney and Edward G. Robinson and George Raft and people like that with Little Caesar and Public Enemy and Scarface, right? That was the last time that mafia movies or mobster movies were really a thing. And now here comes The Godfather, and the studio's kind of thinking, well, okay, let's try and get something out of this. And so they were going to save money by setting it contemporarily, okay? And that means they would be setting it in the early 1970s. And 1970s is a long time ago. When the book takes place, it's the 1940s. You might be thinking, oh, so what? It's either 50 or 70 years later. What's the big deal? But it really was a different time in America. And the 1940s is really the right way to do it. But when you set a movie in the past, if it's a period picture of any kind of a period picture, that means you gotta watch out for clothes. You gotta watch out for all the technology. What kind of cars is everyone driving? What kind of telephones? What kinds of airplanes? What kind, all that stuff comes into play. It really adds a lot of cost to a movie to set a movie, even a few years in the past. Even if you were to set a movie 7 or 8 years ago, what kinds of phones were people using back then? And all of that, and cars and all that. It just adds cost to a movie. And, let alone setting it during, the Renaissance or something like that with Michelangelo. Okay, even setting a movie made in 1970 in 1947, it still adds a lot of cost to the movie. And so they wanted to save money there. They weren't crazy about Brando. He was eccentric for them and not a big draw at the time. And Francis Coppola had to really push to get Brando. He had to push to get Al Pacino, too. Most of the cast, they weren't really the ones that the studio was thinking of. The studio is thinking of the big hot actors of the time. And one of the hot actors of that time was Robert Redford. And he's a very good actor and all that, but he does not look Sicilian. He's tall and fair and blonde and blue eyes, and Sicilians are darker, olive complexion, from the south of Europe, and so on. He doesn't look Sicilian in the least. It would be like casting Brad Pitt or somebody to play a Mexican. Okay, same thing, right? It doesn't really quite work. Brad Pitt's a good actor. I'm sure he'd add some people to the box office, but it's just not good casting. It's just not good casting, really. So he pushed, and he did get Brando, who won the Oscar for Best Acting, right? He won the Oscar for that movie, and we're going to see one of the key scenes in the film, the opening. And in the opening, we don't see we don't see Brando for a couple of minutes. And, the audience is kind of waiting for him. Is that him? Is that him? No, that's not him. He's not the guy talking. He's the guy that we only see the back of his shoulder. And it is set during, let's see here. Yeah. It is set during his daughter's wedding. And out in the backyard is brightness and music and dancing and happy times. And inside, right here, that's it. He's wearing a tuxedo because he's at the wedding. He's in his rather dark office, okay? And he is doing mafia business. And part of tradition in Sicilian weddings is that the father of the bride grants favors. Now, he's not a normal father of the bride. He has lots of power and can grant special favors. So people are coming to him asking for him to kill people and so on. And sometimes to use his sway with judges. That's a kind of a key part of the movie because they have a lot of people on their payroll, politicians and judges and things. So he's in his office and granting favors and things like that. And then he goes to the wedding, back to the office, sort of back and forth like that. We get light and dark, literal and figurative. What some people call the sacred and the profane. I love that, the sacred and the profane. But a little of that is creeping into the wedding because out back are FBI agents, and they are taking down license plate numbers because they know that some of the guests at the wedding are very likely the heads of some of the other mafia families, and taking photos. Now, they can't get in. It's sort of gated there. They can't get into the wedding, of course. But they are there, right? Sort of lurking, a sort of a shadow coming over the wedding, and Vito's son, Sonny, his oldest, is not going to be very happy about that at all. And also, just back from the military is Michael, played by Al Pacino. Again, he'd done some Broadway stuff, he'd done a couple of movies, but not much of a star in 1972. And he was kind of the black sheep of the family. He didn't really want to be in the family business. And after America was bombed at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, he joined up. His father said, no, that's theirs, right? We have our world, Cosa Nostra, that's our world. And it doesn't matter who is elected or any of that. Even in Italy, the mob still went, they still did their thing, even under Mussolini, right? Down there in Sicily and so on, the mafia, they kept on going, right? And when America got over to Europe and was working their way up from North Africa to Sicily to southern Italy, working their way up, they had to deal with the mafia. They had to deal with the mafia and the ports and all that kind of stuff, and they cut some deals. So anyway, Vito, his name is his full name is Vito Andolini. That's his name, Vito Andolini. But when he comes as a small boy, he's running away from the mafia, right? They've killed his father, and they know he's going to seek revenge. So he comes to America through Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty and all that. And while he doesn't speak English very well, and they ask him his name, and he thinks they're asking him where he's from, and so he's from Corleone, Sicily. So instead of being Vito Andolini, he becomes Vito Corleone, and as he works his way up, he is a man of respect, and in Italian culture and in Spanish culture as well, a person of some respect would be referred to as a Don or the Don. His name's not Don. His name's not Donald. His name is Vito. And sometimes they get students who are a little confused as to what his name is. But it's sort of like, the mayor or the senator or whatever, the Don. It's a title. And there are other Dons in the movie. The Dons of the heads of the five family are all Dons. So anyway, just a little point of reference there so you don't get too confused about who he is and so on. And like I said, there are other Dons. Now, there was, they knew that they might have some problems in 1972 filming this notorious book because it's all about the mafia. And they knew that the mafia controlled the Teamsters Union. And the Teamsters Union, right, they used to drive teams of horses, and that became truck drivers and so on. And they knew they could cause trouble, right? Maybe actors didn't make it to the set on time. Maybe the driver got lost. Who knows what, right? So they knew they had to make nice with the local Teamsters and mobsters. And so they did, and part of that was they agreed not to use the term mafia in the movie. And they don't. They do refer to Cosa Nostra, which is another name, actually, our world. Also the Black Hand, or bunches of names for the mafia, but they stayed away from mafia. And at one point, Vito says in Italian or Sicilian, "Welcome to La Cosa Nostra," right? He speaks in Italian. So they were allowed to make the film without trouble. We were going to make the film, but they managed to do it without much trouble. And since then, the mafia people, they were kind of reluctant, right? Staying in the shadows, right? Nobody needs to know what we're doing. There's nothing to see here, so to speak. But after the movie came out and it was such a big hit, some of the mobsters, and with big egos and all that, they're like, yeah, we're the Godfather, and that's us, and sort of coming out, right? They were more or less many layers, just there is always a number of layers between the head of the organization, right? Just the head of the organization. Then he's going to have uh, capos underneath him, and then they're going to have people under them and people under them. So there's probably 2 or 3 layers between the guys that are actually killing and the heads of the families. It's really hard. It's really hard to get these guys. Al Capone, all those guys, they can't get those guys for murder or anything like that. Typically, the way the government can get people like mafia types is for taxes. It's for taxes because they're making lots and lots of money. And what's your job? Oh, I import oil, right? And that's in the Godfather, right? They have the Corleone, I think it is, or Andolini, oil import business from Sicily. Well, how come he lives in such a big house and drives a nice car and all that kind of stuff, and so on? Scarface, right? Swimming pools, all that kind of stuff. Where'd the money come from, right? So that's how the government does it. And as a side point, and that's kind of a big thing in the second movie. They go to Senate hearings and trials and all that, and somebody's about ready to spill the beans, and Michael brings his brother from Sicily there, and then the guy says, "I don't remember nothing. I don't remember nothing." Right? So they lose their witness. So anyway, the mafia actually ended up, this is kind of funny, but they actually ended up using some of the rituals from The Godfather, kissing of the ring, and even the whole term Godfather and all that kind of stuff. They actually incorporated some of that Hollywood stuff into the actual mafia business. And when The Sopranos comes out in the early 2000s, Tony is sort of bemoaning that he wasn't around during the good old days of the mafia and all that. Let's see here. Let's keep going here. It's an important movie. We're spending some time on it. We're going to see, there's a couple of scenes. There's the wedding and the mafia business. And then at the end of the movie, there is a christening of Michael's godson. It's actually, the baby is actually Sofia Coppola, Francis's daughter, but you can't tell when it's a baby. And so it is a wonderful scene of cross-cutting between the baptism and the christening at the church and Michael putting out hits on the people that have done him wrong. Okay, he's pretty vengeful. That's kind of the difference between him and his father. His father's all about family and so on, and Michael has a little bit more of a vengeful streak in him. So we are cross-cut between these scenes, and it is a wonderful bit of editing. You're going to hear the priest doing his bit in Latin, and you're going to hear the baby crying, and you're going to hear an organ playing over cutting to these 5 other hits in a barber chair and in a hotel room and in a lobby, and there's 5 more hits going on, and it's all cut together. It is just a bravura bit of editing. It's just really wonderful. And the other famous scene earlier in the movie with the head of one of the studios, it's a fictitious name, Jack Waltz, but sort of based on Jack Warner, and The Godfather getting his way. And there was a term that was popular after The Godfather came out that people would be saying, just like they do with movies and things like that today. I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse. Okay, and that was sort of a code about either sign the contract or we're going to shoot your brains out. I went blank just a second ago. I was talking about taxes and all that kind of stuff, and how do you hide all of your money, and that made me think very briefly of Breaking Bad and Walter White, and he is making so much money. I'm not sure if you watch Breaking Bad or not. It's a fantastic show. I believe it's on Netflix. You should check it out. And he is very, very smart, and he knows he has to find a way to hide his money. So he buys a car wash to do that, so that he can have his millions of dollars and at least be able to buy something. Uh, okay, anyway, that's kind of a side point there. Walter White and Vito Corleone and all of that. Within a couple of years, Coppola did The Conversation and The Godfather Part Two. Both came out in 1974. He was nominated for Best Director, and they were nominated for Best Picture, both that same year. And that doesn't happen very often. It's happened a couple of times. And sometimes people think that they're going to cancel each other out, and some other movies going to win the Oscars or something. But The Godfather Part Two, he won a whole slew of Oscars, Robert De Niro included. In 1972, I'm sorry for jumping around, but in 1972, when The Godfather was at the Oscars, it won the Best Picture, and Brando won the Best Actor, and it won only one other award, right? It only won 3 Oscars in 1972. And that kind of says a lot about how strong the competition was in the 1970s. There were so many great movies coming out during those days, like Clockwork Orange, and Chinatown, and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's. There was just so many fantastic movies coming out every year. The list of movies that didn't win Oscars in the 1970s is amazing. And today I can't help but think today any one of those movies would run away with awards and stuff based on today's competition, I think. The movie that won most of the Oscars in 1972 is a really good movie, and it seemed more important back then. It's called Cabaret, and it's a musical, but it's set during the rise of the Nazis in Germany. And that seems, pretty important time, right? The rise of the Nazis and Hitler compared to kind of an old-fashioned mafia movie. And so Cabaret won Best Director for Bob Fosse. It won Best Editing. It won Best Cinematography. It won Best Actress for Liza Minnelli. It won Best Supporting Actor for Joel Grey. That's the movie that won all the Oscars, but at the very end of the evening, The Godfather wins the Best Picture. And if Cabaret had won, I don't think people would be thinking, oh, The Godfather was robbed. They're both really good movies, right? And in 1974, The Godfather Part Two, it beat out another fantastic movie, Chinatown, right? Which is really one of the all-time greats, right? But it was just had the bad luck to come out that year. It just had the bad luck. Sometimes everybody's kind of looking at, one movie's going to sweep everything. Kind of like when the third Lord of the Rings movie came out. Just a bad time to come out, or maybe Titanic or something like that. So Coppola had a pretty good decade. Let me see, what is that? 4 films nominated for Best Picture, 4 times he was nominated for Best Director. Godfather, Godfather Part 2, The Conversation, and Apocalypse Now. So that's a pretty darn good decade. And we will talk about Apocalypse Now when we get to Vietnam War films in a class or 2. But now we have to move on to that poor movie that was up against The Godfather Part 2, and that is Chinatown, directed by Roman Polanski. And if you were a fan or have seen Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Quentin Tarantino's last movie, Polanski, of course, was married to Sharon Tate. He was overseas shooting a movie when Sharon Tate and the other people were murdered by the Manson family. So poor Roman Polanski. First, he has to run away from Hitler as a young Pole during World War II, and then with Charles Manson and so on. And he has a checkered history, having sex with a very underage girl after he gave her Quaalude. So he is overseas now. He's in Paris. He is has faced extradition, but he's been over there since he was slated to go to prison in the 1970s. So just a side point. I don't want to get too deep on that. It's a pretty interesting story, and if you are interested in old Hollywood stories and tales and scandals, especially scandals, there's a really good webcast. I might have mentioned it already, and I'll mention it again. It's called You Must Remember This.com is where you'd find it, or you'd find it on iTunes or wherever. And it's about the first 100 years of Hollywood. And she does I think a 6 or 7 part series on Charles Manson's Hollywood. So again, if you're interested in that, you must remember this and look for that. And it's a really good podcast by Karina Longworth. Okay, anyway, back to Chinatown. Jack Nicholson having a pretty darn good decade, and Faye Dunaway, Bonnie of Bonnie and Clyde, and we're going to meet her again in Network. So she's having a very good decade. And this amazing film, it is set in the 1930s. It's a detective. It's kind of revisionist, but not. It's very traditional. I would say it's probably more classic detective than revisionist detective, to tell you the truth. I mean, it's shot as an R-rated movie, but other than that, I think it's pretty traditional detective movie. The plot is rather complicated, like a lot of them were in the 1940s, and it deals with the history of LA's water importance. Okay, getting the water from Owens Lake and so on, and putting in the channels and everything, and the aqueduct to bring the water south hundreds of miles, quite a feat of engineering and so on, that ruined a lot of farmland up there near the base of the Sierras, right? So that's where there's lots of water and so on. Southern California, right? All of LA County, all of Orange County, all of that. Really, with our, I don't know, probably 15, 16, 17 million people, there's not nearly enough water for all of us. Not nearly enough water down here. This is a desert, right? It's a desert down here. Even the palm trees are imported, right? Palm trees aren't even native to Southern California. There's not much here until they brought in the water. LA was growing very fast in the 19-teens and 1920s, and so the water was brought in, and how they got the water and all that. It's the center point of this film. Interestingly, the idea of inside knowledge, people that know that water is going to come through to Southern California know that dry land can be very good farmland. So in the San Fernando Valley, in the movie, and probably in real life too, but in the movie, they start buying up land, knowing that will be worth a lot more money when the water comes through. Now, that is a bit of a trope in terms of movie plots, because there have been westerns, Destry Rides Again is one of them, where people know that the train is going to come through. And when the train comes through and where the train stations are, then that land will be more valuable. So that's kind of the backstory in Destry Rides Again. And Who Framed Roger Rabbit, of all things. A very funny movie. We'll talk about it later. And the freeways coming through, the government is spending lots of money to buy up land, Toontown, and all that. So it kind of, Who Framed Roger Rabbit kind of has the same plot outline as Chinatown. Okay, now, all that stuff I said, notice it's not in the PowerPoint slides. It's just for background information, just for fun. I hope you enjoy all this stuff. The stuff that we're going to talk about on tests is going to be the PowerPoint slides. So you don't have to worry about all these stories about Brando and all that kind of stuff. The key parts are going to be the directors and their films and so on. Okay, so just some fun stuff. This film, Chinatown, is neo-noir, okay, new noir, but it very much is film noir. And it points out the futility of good intentions. And that's part of what makes this script so wonderful. Film schools still teach the script by Robert Towne, and that was the only Oscar it won that night at the Oscars, when everything else is going to The Godfather. But Robert Towne won the Oscar for Best Original Screenplay, I believe. And so you think you're doing the right thing. Now our protagonist here, Jake Gittes, he is asked to find someone. He's asked to find a young girl. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Right? Who wants this young girl to be found? Is he a good guy or a bad guy? What is he going to do once he finds this girl who is related to him in a very complicated way? Let's just put it that way. And so he thinks he's doing the right thing. He has good intentions, and it's kind of futile, right? He thinks he's doing the right thing, and, what do? Somebody's chasing somebody. What happens when you go outside in your neighborhood, okay, or on campus, next time you're on campus, and somebody's chasing somebody else? Are you going to help somebody, right? Is the good guy chasing the bad guy who tried to break into his car or steal his backpack from him? Or is the bad guy chasing the good guy because maybe he looked at his girlfriend the wrong way and smiled at her, right? Who's good and who's bad? What do? Do you help? Okay, and if you help, is it futile? Okay, so that's kind of what this is bringing about, right? The whole idea of the futility of good intentions and moral ambiguity, right? What is it? Morality can be kind of ambiguous, right? There's a lot of gray. There's not that much black and white in the world. There's a lot of gray in the world. And that's why we have trials and things like that, right? If it was all black and white, there would hardly ever be need for judges and juries and things like that, right? It would be cut and dry, black and white, but it's not. That's not the world we live in. There's a lot of moral ambiguity. Okay, so wonderful film, Chinatown. I've linked to a couple of scenes for that. And if you're a wannabe scriptwriter, you should watch this film from start to finish and take notes. So this era in the 1970s of the anti-hero, and this is Robert De Niro as Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver. Talked about that a little bit, and it's a wonderful movie, very dark movie. And he's definitely an anti-hero, as we've talked about, the Vietnam War vet driving a taxi and possible assassin and so on. Midnight Cowboy, we have this hustler, one for sex and so on. Clockwork Orange, Alex, he's really a bad guy, okay? The Godfather. And it's amazing, this movie, The Godfather, that the book and the movie, they have us rooting for the mafia, right? We're rooting for them over the politicians, over the cops, and especially over other families, And the brilliant way that that they do that is that there is a deal that one of the families brings to Vito Corleone. And one of the families wants to bring hard drugs and start dealing with hard drugs like heroin. Okay, and Vito has lots of politicians and judges on his basically payroll. And they want him to smooth the way and have everybody turn the other way and not see while the mafia starts introducing hard drugs. Now, the mafia, they brought alcohol in during Prohibition. Most people thought that was fine. It was good. They were kind of heroic. Al Capone and people like that. And now it's not just alcohol, but we've got an addictive drug in The Godfather. And Vito says no. He doesn't say no because of morals. He doesn't say no because of morals or anything like that. He says no because if the judges and the politicians find out, they will leave him. They will leave him. It's more of a business proposition than anything else. Even though the mafia, and this is pretty dark when you get to this scene, they say, we're just going to deal to the blacks in the ghetto. Don't worry, we're not going to deal to the white people, right? We'll keep it in Harlem and in the ghettos. Yeah. But still, Vito says no. He doesn't want to do it more as a business decision than anything else. So he and Michael and all these guys, they are very flawed, but they're the heroes of the movie. They're the heroes of the movie. Okay, taxi driver, easy rider. Yeah, they're just motorcycle riders, stoners and whatnot, but not your traditional hero. Even the doctors in M.A.S.H. are very anti-authority and so on. Chinatown, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Shampoo, very much anti-heroes. Now, movies have always been full of anti-heroes, even going back to the original gangster movies of the early 1930s with Jimmy Cagney and so on. There's always been anti-heroes, but the 1970s is a real. There's a lot of them. Let's put it that way. There's a lot of anti-heroes for sure. Okay. So, speaking of anti-heroes, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. There we go. And Cuckoo's isn't spelled right. I'm sorry. It's C-U-C-K-O-O. I don't know why. I think somebody probably spelled it funny that way, and I'm sorry I copied it. But it's C-U-C-K-O-O, Cuckoo's Nest, from 1975, and it is a bit of an allegory based on a book. Right? I told you so many really good movies are based on books. This one's based on Ken Kesey's novel, and he was an attendant, not a inpatient, but he was an attendant at a mental hospital up in Oregon when he was a young man, and that's where he first, as another side point, I hope my side points don't throw you off, that's where he volunteered to take LSD for the first time at this mental institution. Again, as an attendant. He wasn't a doctor or a nurse or anything, or a patient. He was just an attendant, sweep the floors, stuff like that. But he volunteered. He discovered LSD. He loved it and became a real proponent of LSD, a big contributor to the Grateful Dead and acid tests and all of that. So Ken Kesey, a very interesting guy. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. A book was written kind of about his acid journeys called The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. So if you want some alternative reading, you might check out Ken Kesey. Okay, back to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest from 1975. And so this allegory, the struggle against societal authority, right? So we're in a mental institution. It could be school. It could be work. It could be the church. It could be any place with an organizational hierarchy, okay? And how do you work in that place where there's authority and people above you and all that chain of command, the military, right? The police, all that, right? So here's the struggle of the individual against authority. That's really what it comes down to. It's set in a mental institution, could be anywhere. The director was Czech. He came from from Czechoslovakia. They were a puppet government from the Soviet Union at the time. And people said, how can you direct this very American story? And he said, oh, I totally got it. The Soviet Union was Big Nurse, right? The antagonist in the movie is the nurse that is running things, Nurse Ratched. He said, oh yeah, the Soviet government was Big Nurse, right? They were the ones that were, against the individual. He said, I totally get it. Very, very much so. So it is the first film since 1934 to win all 5 top Oscars. Now, I'm not the one that decided what the top 5 Oscars are. I have a soft spot in my heart for cinematography and editing. To me, those are pretty key parts of filmmaking. But they don't have stars, actor and actress especially, sometimes directors. So somebody has decided the top 5 Oscars are Best Picture, for sure, Director, for sure, and Script, Actor, and Actress. It won all of those. And Jack Nicholson with his very first of 3 Oscars. And it happened one more time with Silence of the Lambs, with Anthony Hopkins and wonderful film. That's the one with, oh geez, I'm blanking on his name here, but he's the guy that is totally totally nuts, and for some reason he likes to eat his prey. Yeah, so okay, I'm going to keep on moving. I can't pause this thing. Once I get going, once I get going, I got to go. Maybe that's kind of impressive that I can talk about movies for a full hour or so without any other kind of notes or checking online or anything like that. Anyway, oh, Jodie Foster is her name. Sorry, I knew I'd get it. Jodie Foster, Anthony Hopkins. Okay, that's Silence of the Lambs. All right, so wonderful film. I've linked to some great scenes from this as well, and we see them sort of budding authority and so on. And there we go, Jack Nicholson. There he is in One Flew the Cuckoo's Nest. Had a pretty good decade himself, just like some of these directors. And Easy Rider, actually Easy Rider from '69, and The Shining from 1980. But that's a pretty good list right there, and that's not even all of his movies. A little bit more about One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Randall Patrick McMurphy is in prison, and we don't even see this part of the story, but he's in prison, and he hears about this mental institution and what a sweet life it is that you just sit around and play cards all day and listen to music, and you're not out in the hot sun breaking the rocks and all of that. And so he decides that that's what he wants to do for the last 6 months or so of his sentence, is to have a sweet ride. So he acts out, he gets committed to the hospital, but what he doesn't know is once you are in a mental institution like he is, been committed, it's not, there's no calendar, right? He's in until he's better. He's in until he's better. He's not in for just 6 more months the rest of his sentence. And so he has anger issues. He's definitely the type A personality, okay, the big dog, with these other people who are truly mentally ill. And so it's kind of a shock late in the movie when he finds out that he doesn't just have 6 months to go. The other shock that he gets in the movie, well, he gets that's a bad joke. They have shock therapy, shock treatment, and it's still around today. Some people consider it to be positively medieval torture, but other people swear even today that sending electrical shocks directly into the brain, right, putting pads on somebody's head and turning it on briefly and so on, has helped them get over problems that they've had. So yeah, this movie is shocking. The other shock, though, the other metaphorical shock in the film is that all the other guys there, and a great bunch of guys, Danny DeVito and Christopher Lloyd, great bunch of actors, they're all complaining about Big Nurse, and when I got out of here, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that, and they complain with him throughout the whole movie, and he finds out late that they can leave anytime they want. They are self-admitted. They and their families have determined that they need professional help. And he's shocked that if you can leave, why don't you leave, right? But they know that they need help of some sort. There's only one other person that's in there unwillingly, and that is Chief Broom. And Chief Broom, his real name is Bromden. He stands with a broom, or fake broom, and doesn't speak. They don't even know if he can hear. And there's kind of a shocking scene that explains some of that. And I've linked to that, right? So Chief Broom and McMurphy. So very much part of the zeitgeist of the 1970s, the individual, anti-authority, all that, right? All these movies are so perfect for the 1970s. And we have Network, second to last movie, okay, Network by Sidney Lumet. He was part of the live TV generation. And I linked these two movies together. At first it was accidental, and then I discovered, well, they're both about mental illness. This is perfect. And Howard Beale is a network news anchor. Now, network news anchors used to be a very big deal because that's how people got their news, right? There was no internet in the very little internet in the 1970s, and people got their news. No cable, very little cable TV. It was sort of on on the edge. A little bit of cable, not much internet. So everybody got their news from the national newscasts that were on at 6:30 every evening. And those three white men, for the most part, three white men, were very important, very highly regarded, even more highly regarded than the president in many instances, and trusted. Okay, Walter Cronkite was the most trusted man in America during the Vietnam War. So this is from the 1970s when this was, they were very trusted and very important. And Howard Beale starts having mental problems. He starts hearing voices and things like that. It's a wonderful script by Pat H. Chayefsky. So Sidney Lumet, great job from the live TV generation, but really the central point is this wonderful script by Patty Chayefsky predicting these angry newscasters, and Howard Beale has this rant, I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore, right? Mostly out of frustration, right? The angry white male, and we have plenty of angry white males in society, voting and all of that, right? I don't want to draw lines or anything like that in the sand about specifics, but he is certainly an angry man, frustrated. You feel impotence, right? I can't do anything about it, crime or the economy or whatever. And so he starts acting out right in the middle of the newscast. I'm as mad as hell. I'm not going to take this anymore. And normally you'd think this man needs help. And his friend, his best friend, one of the people at the network, wants him to get medical attention. But other people at the network, and the head of entertainment programming, played by Faye Dunaway, she does a great job in this movie, she sees a spike in viewership because people want to tune in to find out if this guy's going to go nuts on the air. Okay, now this really predicts, because that's the way a lot of television is with competition shows and things like that. Not so much with American Idol, but certainly with shows like Survivor and Bachelors and Bachelorettes and all that kind of stuff, right? There are so many of these shows that people are going to freak out, or they're going to scream, or they're going to cry, or who knows what. And people love to see real emotion on TV. Now, of course, with a whole bunch of cameras around you, who knows how real emotions are on Real Housewives or whatever. But this is the first one to sort of predict this stuff, right? People's fascination with live mental problems, I guess you could say. Okay, it really predicts that. And also the rise of multinational conglomerates. So I've linked to that wonderful scene where the head, not of the network, but the head of the corporation that owns the network, sets Howard Beale down to tell him about there are no countries. There is only corporations, right? And he mentions Dow Chemical and AT&T. Today he could mention Google or Facebook or Apple, right? These are bigger than any country, richer than many countries, and have no borders, right? So he kind of predicts this stuff way back in the 70s. He's talking about giant multinational conglomerates. It's just amazing. And also, again, reality TV. They set a camera crew to follow around some domestic terrorists. They're sort of loosely based on the Black Panthers, a militant group from the late 60s and early 70s. They were very disciplined. They wore black berets and so on, and were arming up, and sometimes feeding children and so on. So they were seen as sort of Robin Hoods, but they were going to stand up to the police. And so that's where the Black Panthers, by the way, that was the original Black Panther, and then the comics and all that sort of descended from that. But those are the Black Panthers. And in the film, They're going to set a camera crew around following them as maybe they rob banks and stuff like that, because there were some offshoots of the Panthers. So a really amazing film in its predictive qualities. Okay, our very last film for the day, we won't spend a whole lot of time on it, All the President's Men from 1976. And this is about the Watergate break-in and cover-up. We talked about Watergate when we were talking about the social conditions that led to these amazing movies, right? All this social stuff with the music and the drugs and all that kind of stuff. And one of the points was the Watergate break-in, so we've already talked about that, and cover-up, and two Washington Post reporters, and they, they're probably a little more handsome than the real guys, but the real guys were, they were young and blonde and whatever, and all that. Woodward and Bernstein, okay, and so this all happened in 1972, 73. Then they reported for the newspaper. Then their book came out, All the President's Men, in maybe 1974, 75, and it was a big best-selling book, so they turned it into a movie. And again, perfect for the times, perfect for the 70s, corruption at the highest levels of the government. And they had an inside source. As good reporters, right? You want to get your sources and so on. You should have a couple of sources, by the way, not just one. But anyway, they had a source, and they called him our friend for a while in the newspaper. When they wrote the book, somebody said, well, we got to give him some sort of a name. So they called him Deep Throat. Now that's kind of funny because that's the name of a rather famous and infamous and notorious porn film. But anyway, they called him Deep Throat. And they wouldn't name him. They didn't name him until he died 3 or 4 years ago. It's amazing to keep a secret. It's almost impossible to keep a secret that long in Washington, D.C. But only those two and the editor and the publisher of the newspaper. I think there were only 4 people that knew who Deep Throat was. And he turned out to have been very high up in the FBI, the number 2 man at the FBI. Mark Felt was his name. And they revealed his name after he passed away. So, very definitely of the 1970s. So all these amazing movies, they just don't make movies like this anymore. They really don't. Big movies with big stars usually are the big superhero movies, whether it's a Star Wars movie or a Marvel movie or a Fast and Furious movie or something like that, or a James Bond movie, right? The big budget movies are fantasies and sci-fi and so on. And these used to be, not every one of them was a big budget movie, but there used to be this sort of big-ish movie. Now, I have Once Upon a Time in Hollywood down here because that's kind of the kind of movie they're not making much anymore. 2 big stars, Leonardo DiCaprio, Brad Pitt, in a big-ish, I think the budget was $90 million, okay, not $200 million like, some of those movies, or $300 million. Avengers Endgame, I think, closed in on $300 million. But these dramas, right, they're dramas, but they have action, they have big stars and all that. Network, All the President's Men, Chinatown, Godfather. They're really not making these kinds of movies anymore. Either a small movie, $50 or $60 million, yes, that's small, or really big, but mid-budget movies, right? Mid-budget movies are kind of gone away. The movies that tend to win Oscars, like The Green Book or Spotlight, or movies like that, they're low-ish budget movies. Okay, they're really kind of low-ish budget movies, and they're kind of then you kind of go all the way big with the big budget movies. But this mid-budget, they're kind of gone, and that's really too bad because they're really good movies. Okay, so you are now ready to take the first test. You don't have to take it right now, of course. You need to take it on the day that it is given in the syllabus. Okay, and it will be offered for 24 hours, starting at midnight and going to 11:59 p.m. on whatever day is stated in the syllabus. So check that out. It is timed, and you have 25 minutes. Okay, you can't look at the test. You can't click on it because then the clock starts and you can't stop it. Okay, as soon as you open the door, okay, then off it goes. And I've had students in the spring and in the summer complaining, Professor, I started the test and everything. And I actually had one student that she understood all this, and she tried to take the test at 11:50. And sure enough, 9 minutes later, it stopped. She thought if she started the test before 11:59, she'd have 25 minutes. Well, no, you don't. So you got to start it no later than 11:30 if you're going to take it that night. So whatever day it is, it will start while you're still asleep in bed at midnight, and then our class, which would be in the morning or afternoon or whatever, you can take it during class, but you have until 11:59 to take it. You can't look at it. I had students, I just wanted to look at it and see, no, you can't do that. It will start the clock. Get ready, okay? And no notes, no books, no online, none of that stuff. I can't stop you from going to the bathroom, of course, but it's serious. It's serious. Treat it like you're in the classroom. Treat it like you're in the classroom. Shush everybody. Tell everybody to be quiet. Okay, and study as hard as you can, just like you would in the classroom. Study, 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 right up to the time you're going to take the test. You don't have to take it during class. You'd have to take it on that day, and then you take it. Okay, and as soon as you're done, you will get your results. Every once in a while, I make a mistake. I can fix it. One of the wonderful things about Canvas is if I mark the correct answer incorrectly, I can go into the test and change it, and all of the scores of everybody who took the test will change. Okay, so that's kind of a cool thing about Canvas. I promise to do as good a job as I can looking over the test, but if it happens, you can let me know, and I will change it, and it will change all the scores and everything. But treat it seriously, okay? Treat it seriously, get ready, and take it all at once on that day, and it will cover the first 5 classes. So if you want to, and I won't make class 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 available till after the day that the test is to be given. Okay, I think I open up those other classes at noon on the test day. So everything else is closed off to you till the day of the test. You can take the classes early. You can binge the classes, take them as early as you want, but then the breaks will go on and nothing else will be available to you until the test day, and then the next third of classes will be available. You can work on your papers and stuff, but otherwise it will be closed off to you. Okay, that is it. A big day, big important films. I have no idea how long it goes. I don't pause or stop while I'm doing this, so it's always a surprise to me how long all this stuff takes. So I'm going to find out right now. I hope you enjoyed the class. There's, after the lecture, of course, there's all these wonderful links also there in the module in Canvas, and please watch all of them, and they will make it for a much richer experience. Actually, ideally, you were watching the PowerPoint and then watching the film clips and then going back to the PowerPoint again. But in any event, make sure you watch all that stuff. Thank you so much. Until next time, take care.